Well, good evening to our BGS members here in New Zealand. Good afternoon to our fellow members in Australia and Hong Kong. And welcome to the extended BGS community who may be watching from around the globe. And to those who are not members, welcome. It is great that you can join us here tonight. Tonight being New Zealand time. My name is Alex Waddell and I am the president of the New Zealand Alumni chapter of Beta Gamma Sigma, or BGS for short. On behalf of BGS Asia Pacific, which currently consists of chapters within New Zealand, Hong Kong, and Australia, it's my privilege to introduce the inaugural BGS Asia Pacific Region IDEA Exchange. This event, which comprises of a speaker from each of the three countries, was born out of a desire to increase the collaboration between BGS chapters from around the Asia Pacific region in order to grow and strengthen networks and build relationships between the countries. And what we hope will be the start of many initiatives throughout the Asia Pacific region. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the first speaker of this IDEA Exchange series. To do this, I would love to introduce Melanie Barr, who is going to MC this event tonight. Melanie.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Melanie Barr and I'm the Director of Student Business and Community Partnerships with the Faculty of Business, Economics and Law at AUT. That is a real big mouthful to say every time I have to say it. It's my real pleasure to be the MC at the inaugural BGS Asia Pacific IDEA Exchange. We are really proud of our great graduates at AUT and it brings me such great joy to support and partner with the BGS NZ chapter, championing the success and development of such a forward-thinking group. Some housekeeping to get us started. Please everyone keep your mics off. Wes has got the ultimate control and you can't unmic yourself anyway, but do keep your videos on so our wonderful speaker is not talking to himself. It's really nice to see reactions and faces, so please turn on your videos. We will take questions at the end of the session, and if you would like to post your questions in the chat box as you think of them, please do so, and they'll be answered at the end. At the end, if you would like to ask your question in person, you can raise your hand via Zoom, and we'll facilitate that for you. Tonight, we are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Harold Hillman, who will be giving his presentation, followed by, as I said, the Q&A session. A little bit about Harold. Harold Hillman is the Managing Director of Sigmoid Curve Consulting Group. Sigmoid specializes in tools and frameworks that help executive teams lead their organizations through major change, with a collective sense of ownership and commitment to strong results. Over the past 2 decades, as both a senior executive and external coach, Harold has coached a number of prominent chief executives and their teams in the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore. Harold's clients include National Australia Bank, Kraft Heinz Company, Fonterra, Sea Lord, and Air New Zealand. A few of Harold's highlights in his career include Assistant Professor and Director of the Leadership Program at the US Air Force Academy, Director of Amoco Management Learning Center in Chicago, Corporate Vice President and Chief Learning Officer of Prudential Financial in New York, and the Global HR Director Interim and Director of Talent at Fonterra Cooperative Group here in Auckland. Harold earned a master's degree in education from Harvard University and a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Pittsburgh. Harold has written a number of books, the first being The Imposter Syndrome, which was named Whitcoul's Business Book of the Year in 2013. I'm going to get a copy tomorrow. I have the severe imposter syndrome. Harold's second book, Fitting In, Standing Out, was published by Penguin Random House in August 2015. I also hear he might have another book coming out in August, so hopefully we all keep abreast of that announcement. Today, Harold will be discussing the topic of empathy, the core of modern leadership. In his presentation, Harold will focus on the importance of emotional intelligence and human connection as an integral component of business success. As amplified through the COVID pandemic, modern leadership now places empathy at its core and is no longer a tick-the-box exercise. So welcome, Harold. Thanks so much for being part of the BGS Asia Pacific IDEA Exchange today.
Melanie, thank you very much for that the very warm introduction. It's a pleasure to see you again. It's been, you and I were mentioning a few minutes ago, it's probably been the better part of 8 months since we connected at AUT. And so thank you for facilitating tonight. And Alex Waddell is a dear friend, has been for 18 years, and I get a lot of energy out of how invigorated he is in his role as BGS New Zealand Alumni Chapter President. And so it's really cool to be able to be introduced by the two of you. Thank you for that. Now let me bring up my anxiety is always over whether or not I will be able to bring the presentation up. So let me just get that out of the way. That is it exacerbates my phobia over trying to do anything technological on laptops. And so thank you for bearing through that. It is a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. The topic is empathy. It's a timely one based on the world we all have lived in over the last year and a half. It seems like a different world just 18 months ago. I remember visiting the States in January of 2020. My ex-wife died, and I went over with my daughters to build and lead a memorial service for Kim, and knowing that my daughters were going to be in a scenario where they really missed their mom. My daughters called their mom every day. All their life, they checked in with their mom. And I realized that was going to be a big void in their life. And lo and behold, wouldn't you know that a few weeks later, COVID hit. And it was a scenario where they both then were, like all of us, in a very reactive mode in terms of just, making sense of the world that was unfolded. So they had to park their grief a bit, put it on in terms of working through it. And that was one scenario amongst millions and millions and millions that many people, in terms of how they have been impacted by a pandemic, a word that many of us had never used before, but all of a sudden it became the most used word in the world in terms of its impact. This has been a period of time where for anyone who requires stability in their life, some people really do have a high threshold for having things nailed down in terms of how life unfolds. And those people often wear vulnerability more as a vice than a virtue in that respect. There, some people really struggle with not having a playbook. For many people, in terms of how they navigate through life, this daunting scenario of no playbook and building it, making it up day by day as we went along, would have been, for some people, it would have been exhilarating, but for some people, it would have been quite daunting. It reinforces certainly that what we know around what we call leadership competencies and those things that organizations are now looking for in leaders. And they are looking for agility. The change in leadership agility, change agility in particular, the ability to recognize that the cycles of change have compressed almost threefold over the last 15 years, to the point where now change is the norm. No, there's always the inherent tension between managing and leading, stabilizing and destabilizing. But destabilizing is happening a lot quicker now in life, in the world, in business. And COVID-19, the pandemic scenario, has certainly brought that to light, that to succeed in the decade ahead, we really are going to have to focus on how to make change a more positive construct for people. Sometimes it'll come at us, as in the case of COVID, but sometimes we have to, in fact, disturb the peace and initiate change as well. So that's one of the key insights that I'm taking out of this experience here, is that this was a big wake-up call, still is, in terms of how we're all navigating through it and finding our way. A real big wake-up call that that vulnerability is a reality now in the world. No matter what organization you work in, helping people navigate their way through change is something that we have to get smarter about, and begin to build that capability more sooner than later around that. So I can imagine that many of you have probably had the perspective of sitting back and doing a lot of introspection and reflection on what the meaning, the bigger meaning of life. I've told people in conversations over the last year, interestingly enough, I had my worst year business-wise last year. My business was directly impacted by COVID, not to the extent that many other businesses were, where people really were like faced with the scenario of how they were going to pay next month's rent or things like that. I had enough of a buffer, but it was a real wake-up call to me in the sense of what really is important in life. I used to measure success by quantity. Last year put some things in perspective for me around quality, around connection, around relationship, those types of things. My youngest daughter was diagnosed with COVID in March of last year. She lives in California. She's single, so she lives by herself. And she had to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. She was diagnosed over a screen, a laptop screen. The doctors were inundated. Her doctor, all doctors were at that point in California, particularly in the LA area, which got hit hard in an initial wave. And so she was told not to come to the hospital unless she was experiencing respiratory symptoms, but otherwise to quarantine for 2 weeks, not to have anyone inside. And that was her reality. And she was terrified on that first night. And it was a feeling, it was one of those moments where I realized I was writing a book on empathy. I was writing the book on empathy at the time, and it was a real lesson around the fact that sometimes you can't do, as a dad, I wanted to pick up the credit card and pay for something or get somebody there or do something. I couldn't travel there. There was the bubble had closed, and it was, what I learned was that very often what people really need from you is for you to be there. Just be there, not necessarily physically, but to be there. I connected with Alexis every night for 14 days. We watched movies together online. We listened to music. And I was used to being the dad who could fix things with a credit card or the right connections, as opposed to really appreciating that the essence of connection sometimes is just to be there. Was a bit of perspective. Apologies, I get a bit emotional talking about it, so I need to keep myself going. But it's a quality prevailed. Quality prevailed last year, and it was a lens shift for me. Quality over quantity in many ways, in many aspects, a big important insight and revelation that already has changed the way I live and will continue to change the way I live. And so I hope that for all of you, there's been some opportunity to go deep and to introspect. It was Dr. Aristotle who said that we, either adversity will find us or we seek it out to grow character. And I hope that most of us, many of us, all of us have had some opportunity to reprioritize what is important in life. I did worry in January of 2020 when I started to write the book, could I make it real? Could I make it tangible? That was my biggest concern. And then the pandemic hit. And then there were just all kinds of rich examples all around us, locally, nationally, globally, good and bad examples in terms of the difference that empathy could make in a real-time scenario. Every single person on the earth walking through this experience, going through this experience, will have experienced one form of empathy or the other. And it's a rare scenario where every single one of us went through this thing together. I've never had that experience before in my lifetime. Neither have any of you probably. So this was a real scenario where we could actually understand and relate to what other people, what many people around us, particularly in a leadership construct, would have been going through. It really brought to light then the book. Back in 1995, Daniel Goleman wrote this is a seminal book here. This is in the history of leadership books. This book is significant. Daniel Goleman predicted in 1995 that this thing called EQ, emotional intelligence, over the next 2 decades, he predicted, would be more important than IQ. Equally or more important than IQ, particularly for success in leadership and in life. And put your head around that. This was 1995. The management paradigm still prevailed. This thing called EQ was fitting in that same basket with diversity, inclusion, what was called the soft skills. As a matter of fact, that was the term that was used to describe EQ, the soft skills versus the hard skills, which were on the management side of processes, systems, protocols, things that were tangible, that you could put your hands on and drive and manipulate, as opposed to the soft stuff that implied that it was probably less important. And that was the attitude. That was the demeanor. I was a young executive at Amoco Corporation, and I remember a leadership program, a forum with nearly 100 managers there. They were mostly male, most of them engineers, and there was just a general laughter about this construct called EQ, and particularly this premise that it would make more of a difference than IQ in leadership and in life within 2 decades. That was a revolutionary proclamation for Daniel Goleman to make. And now here we are 25 years later. And I think all of us, in reflecting back over the last year, would agree that EQ has played a big role in how we have navigated through it personally and how we have navigated through it as leaders. Leaders not only in a business context, but leaders in the community, leaders in families, just life in general. EQ, emotional intelligence, became real there. In the construct of emotional intelligence, there are 4 components with empathy at the core. The first component is to have high emotional intelligence. It helps for you to be self-aware, to know yourself reasonably well, particularly if you're in a leadership role, particularly if you're in a senior leadership role. The more senior your role, the bigger your shadow in terms of impact. So you've got to be able to see what other people see, and you've got to be reasonably calibrated with the fact that Even though you may have this ideal version of yourself here, there are some things that are dragging your ability to connect with others down in that respect. So self-awareness is coming to terms with, hey, what do I do well? What do I do well? In my aptitude, what am I wired for? Some people are wired to be analytical. Some people are wired to be diagrammatic in terms of seeing the system. Some people are wired to be conceptual. Some people are wired to be relational. Some are more task. We are all wired differently in terms of our neurology, essentially. And so the essence of self-awareness is, are you doing things that play to your strengths? Those things that are just inherent strengths. Not a whole lot of focus on weakness as much as focus on your strengths. These are things that in some cases are your hard wiring, but in other cases are just those things that you've been reinforced for over your lifetime, and they energize you. And so with self-awareness, can you keep yourself in an optimal zone majority of the time? Do you know those things that you should push yourself towards and those things that maybe you should not stay? If you're not good at numbers, don't go into accounting. If you're not good, you know what I mean? It's knowing yourself around those choices. If you know yourself, then it also means that you can manage. It's called self-management in the sense of, hey, if you've gone 3-4 days without good sleep, you may want to do something about that real quickly, because without good sleep, it is going to break connection with other people. You can't be as effective. So self-management is keeping an eye on your resilience, your physicality. Self-management is knowing how in the moment to make a decision. So self-management would be a scenario if you've ever been doing a presentation and you decided, something tells you, hey, it's not going quite the way I wanted it to. Maybe I should adjust here. Sometimes you make yourself smaller to give people more latitude, and sometimes you make yourself bigger to bring more power to what it is you're doing. And that it's that notion of self-management that you can regulate yourself to be able to keep connection as strong as possible. Then there's the interpersonal or the social awareness component of emotional intelligence. And that is just, being a decent person in terms of particularly connection with people as whole people, even pre-COVID, but certainly during COVID. If someone's child is sick, it means a lot to them if you just step outside your office and go over and have a conversation with them at the desk, not about work, but how things are coping. For people who are working their way through different challenges, whether it be at work in terms of particularly people that you have in stretch who you are asking to do bigger things, just staying close to them. How are things tracking? How are things going? There's the social awareness component of emotional intelligence is important. It's hard to build social awareness if you keep yourself sort of contained in what I call first circle, which is where you're more comfortable in here as opposed to out there. Emotional intelligence, even for introverts, it requires a certain degree of social awareness and connectivity. And then relationship management, stakeholders, key stakeholders in your world, in your life. But certainly in a business context, are you making the time to just connect with people and make sure that there is significant that you have the ability to influence through a strong foundation of trust. That really is the essence of relationship management. Empathy sits at the core, and that's the premise of the book, Empathy, the Human Side of Leadership. We are wired for empathy as human beings. As mammals, we are wired for empathy. Human beings tend to be a bit more selective in how we display it, but the bottom line is the hard wiring is there with respect to being able to go inward occasionally around self-awareness. Sometimes we aren't empathetic enough with ourselves. particularly for people who have high standards and perfection and those types of things. Sometimes we display a lack of compassion with ourselves. And as Brené Brown points out in her TED Talk, The Power of Vulnerability, it is difficult to be compassionate with other people when you're not compassionate with yourself. And so empathy has the ability to go inward in terms of you and how you regard yourself in life, and also the ability to go outward with respect to how other people experience you in social and relational connections there. I use the trust triangle to emphasize the importance of empathy. This is from a 2018 TED Talk by Francis Frey, a Harvard Business School professor, who makes the point that around logic, authenticity, and empathy, these are the three things that you want to ensure in any connection with another person, whether it be your partner, whether it be your peers at work, whether it be key stakeholders in the business value chain, whatever it is, that these three things are important. If they look familiar, perhaps with slightly different language, this was from Dr. Aristotle as well. Dr. Aristotle called these the three proofs of rhetorical persuasion. And as an executive coach, Aristotle coached leaders that he called authenticity ethos in terms of character. He called empathy pathos in terms of that emotive connection. And logic he called logos. And it was the same three proofs, if you will, now in 2018 language, that if you can establish as a person with another person, a team with another team, key stakeholders, different organizations with each other, if you've got these three things in sync, in terms of what Francis Frey refers to as none of them are wobbly. If any of them are wobbly, you really have to focus on them. And the essence of this really reinforces the significance of empathy. Authenticity, of course, is, in terms of ethos, it's character. It's a person who gives you a consistent experience, a genuine experience. There is power in consistency. Even if you differ with a person, they appreciate the fact that you rock up most of the time as the same person. Logic is important. Logic is, in terms of logos, you got to get on the same page with another person every now and then. Sometimes it's your partner at home. Sometimes it's a business partner. Sometimes it's peers, it's bosses and direct reports. Logic helps. Logic requires a little bit of work. It usually doesn't happen in one conversation. NLP research tells us that it often takes about 7 conversations to get another person on the same page with you, logically and viscerally. About 7 conversations. Sometimes we think that a PowerPoint will wrap it up, when in fact, very often, that's just conversation number 1. And then there's empathy, and empathy is what I want to take you through here. Empathy and sympathy, they sometimes they are compared with each other almost in a competitive way. Which is better, which is worse, that type of thing. For me, empathy and sympathy are 2 sides of the same coin. And the coin is called caring, the ability to care. What does it mean to care for another person? Sympathy is when you feel for another person. It's a situation that you can understand might be painful. You've never been through it before. You make a symbolic gesture. Sometimes when you sympathize with another person, sometimes it can come across as pity, but in general, it comes across as and perceived as a person with good intent who wants me to feel better. And that is when you send flowers to someone who's lost a parent, even when you go to the memorial service. It's an act of sympathy. When after the horrific Christchurch shootings, we saw outpourings of sympathy across New Zealand with many tributes around, with people coming and leaving teddy bears and flowers and adornments. Those were people who wanted to symbolically make the case that we care. And sympathy is a gesture. It is, I feel for you in terms of the scenario, even though I have never been through it before. Empathy is a bit deeper. It's a bit deeper. It is, I feel with you. I feel with you. So I feel for you and I feel with you. Both are important. They shouldn't be contrasted in that respect. As a matter of fact, some constructs around empathy position sympathy as the deepest form of empathy in that sense of compassion. And that is, sometimes it really does matter if you show up at a memorial service. Sometimes it really does matter if you make a gesture that shouldn't, that you may not think makes all that difference in the world, but means a lot to other people. So think of empathy and sympathy as the same construct, two sides of the same coin, the coin called caring. I talk about the rule of three in the book. The rule of three. There are three types of empathy. One is cognitive, one is emotional, and one is compassionate. And we typically think of that as head, heart, and hands. This would be an image of my grandson and my grandsons, but my 8-year-old grandson who, they were out of school in LA for 13 months. They were, my youngest grandson started kindergarten on the screen, virtually. That was his mental model for school. And so my daughter and her husband, John, had to give the boys a lot of space to appreciate that that was a different scenario for them to be sitting at the dining room table in a reasonably small home. And to understand that a lot of structure imposed on kids who all of a sudden were snatched from a social scenario was, hey, maybe we just need to give them a little bit of space in terms of adjusting. Something that she nor John had been through themselves ever before, but it was something that many parents had to adjust to in the sense of what must this be like? Cognitive empathy is, you haven't been through it, but you understand it must be tough. And so it makes a big difference there. Emotional empathy. These are, I was in a presentation a little bit earlier today, and I told the story of a migrant to New Zealand, whose name is Hillman. And the team decided to, they found his name too difficult to pronounce, and so they decided to shorten it to M. They started calling him M. That's M. And he thought, okay, particularly in terms of wanting to fit in and be deemed acceptable. It wasn't until a person joined the team a few weeks later, and she said to him, hey, what's your name? And he said, they call me M. And she said, well, what's your given name? And he said, Imran. And she said, I like that. I like your name. Can I call you by your name? And then she pointed it out to her other peers that, hey, his name is not that much more difficult than Sebastian or Marilyn. And so therefore, why can't he be Imran? Why does he have to be M? That type of a scenario there. The team understood after she pointed it out to them. That would be an example of cognitive empathy. This might be Imran sitting with another migrant from a nation in the Middle East or even Asia, where very often we require people to adjust their accents and their names accordingly to fit in, to make it easier for those around them in that respect there. Sometimes the empathy is a bit deeper. It's a bit more connecting. It's deeper, emotional empathy is deeper than cognitive empathy, where you understand what that must be like, versus I've walked in your shoes, bro. I know exactly what that is probably like. So that's emotional empathy. You want to be a bit careful with emotional empathy, particularly if you're a boss, to the point where it does not become emotional contagion. And that is, you begin where you begin to wear the person's pain, as opposed to being able to empathize with them in terms of acknowledging, I know what that feels like. Sometimes with emotional empathy, we start to wear their pain, and that's not helpful. That's not helpful. And then there's compassionate empathy. Compassionate empathy is where you extend a hand. Tell someone to go home for a half day. Hey, look, I know you got some stuff going on with the kids. Go home and take care of that type of thing. Where you make adjustments. You all would have been all across compassionate empathy over the last year and a half with respect to compassionate empathy could be something as what you think is simple, but is very meaningful to a person, and it is just calling in to check on them. It's an act of compassion. Just lending a hand, lending an ear, being present, being there. That type of thing is compassionate. Never assume that something is too small when it comes to what another person may need. I'm nearly at the end, so I want to be able to take questions. This is the second circle introduced in a book in 2009 by Patsy Rodenberg, an acting director who required her actors to go out on stage in second circle because she believed that second circle was where connection resides. It's hard to be connected if you're in first circle, that blue circle over there towards the end there, because you're there but not there. You ever been in a conversation with someone and you sense that they're not there? They're there physically, but they're not there. It's hard to show for empathy if you're at the previous meeting that you just came from, rather than there with the person. Or you're at the next meeting. You ever been in a conversation with the person and you're already at the next meeting? It's hard. That's being in first circle. Third circle is a different energy. That's the red circle, and that is where you're there, but you're there in spades and you're all over everyone. In terms of, in first circle, there's too little energy coming from you, and in third circle, there's too much coming from you. And that is maybe being frustrated when someone and just telling them, forget it, here's what I would do, now you do the same type of thing. That's a third circle energy versus being there in second circle with another person, sort of helping them find their way, navigate their path. You may feel like you've got a plan, but it may erode their confidence if you are always in third circle, being very, very directive. And so it's hard to show empathy in first circle. It's hard to show empathy in third circle. Second circle is the circle of connection. It requires the ability to be present, to breathe, to give and take. It's where mindfulness resides. It's where presence resides. It's hard to have executive presence if you're not present. Empathy requires you to be present. I will end with just basically saying, be mindful of your leadership shadow, whether that be you, the leader, maybe not even leading a team, but just influence with your peers, etc. But if you do lead a team now, make sure that you are always mindful of whether your shadow really reflects the values that you say are important, are meaningful now in terms of connection, because it can have major impact in both a negative, but conversely in a very positive way, if you create a culture where empathy can actually flourish in terms of helping people thrive, remain engaged, and work their way through change, feeling more supported in the process there. Let me stop there. Melanie?
Hello, that was great. We've had no questions through on the chat, so what I think we can do is open the floor up. If someone has a question, raise your virtual hand, and Wes can unmute you. You'll get a pop-up saying you're now able to unmute yourself, and we can take some questions from the audience.
I'd be curious as to whether or not there is a good component in the first circle. There's a good component in the third circle. It's in that outer region where they all are there. So many of you would have gone into first circle in that introspective zone as we were working our way through this. And I was just curious as to what have you been pondering? What have you been reflecting on over the last little bit?
Richard is raising his physical hand. If we could unmute Richard Brown, Wes, we've got a question.
Hey Harold, can you hear me?
I can, Richard.
Good to see you.
Mm-hmm.
So with reflecting on taking staff through, we're an essential business during COVID, and taking staff through that, there was a lot of time initially in that first circle just thinking, how the hell are we going to do this type thing? Because it was fascinating that people that came into work and had to explain to their partners why they were actually coming to work and how they were going to be safe. And that was quite and so it was a lot of first circle, and then getting into that second circle just to share ideas. Are we being safe? And then, but then also holding the space for a couple of weeks so that we could prove that we were safe, because that was the only way that our loved ones at home were going to understand.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. You would have been in first circle. Many of us would have gone into first circle, particularly with, keep in mind that vulnerability is a natural condition of being human. It's that sense of how we react to when we feel exposed. Exposed meaning literally no playbook in that respect there. The clinical term for that is anxiety. And with both vulnerability and anxiety, there's an inclination for people to go inward and downward. And so very often your role, if you really want to display empathy with people who are working their way through a vulnerable scenario, very often your role might be to just lift their perspective upward and outward. Yeah, it's completely different energy. You don't have to solve anything for them, but just sort of make sure that they are keeping the bigger picture and the broader picture. It's a different energy when you go inward and downward. It's a natural thing to do. So you all around, just being mindful of how people have navigated through COVID, both in your personal lives and in your professional lives, you will find yourself, whether it be talking with a friend or talking with a direct report very often, just helping them to think differently about a particular scenario. And that in and of itself would be a great example of compassionate empathy. Empathy does not require you to fix anything for anyone. It's a lesson I learned in life. It does not require you to fix anything. All it requires you to be is, empathy is about a person feeling that you understand and are, sometimes we judge people. People feel judged when we're listening to them. We sigh, we roll our eyes, we check our watch, we pay attention. You know what I mean? That's the whole shadow component there. If you're in a leadership role, you should be mindful around the presence thing. And Richard, I totally agree in terms of going into first circle to be introspective, but it sounds like also then coming into second circle to help people have meaningful conversations, finding their way and those types of things.
You just need that time to assess and just to understand what it's all about before you
Most certainly. Absolutely. Yeah. That's my natural inclination as well. I go introspective in terms of, I'm more inclined. The premise behind the three circles is that each of us are going to, by default, either go left or right. There'll be some scenarios that will reverse that, but that there's a general inclination. I'm inclined to go towards first circle in that respect there. So I can relate, some folks are inclined more to go towards third circle there. The important thing, particularly when working, coaching people, is to have them realize that real connection happens with others, particularly the ability to empathize typically is happening in second circle.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
We have a question in the chat. So we've got Robert Kilpatrick who has asked, empathy is good, but it's possible to overdo it, isn't it? When someone isn't performing, you can be empathetic, but productivity is essential too. How do you know when you are overdoing empathy?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it emphasizes again, particularly around emotional empathy. We all probably have had to sit down occasionally with a boss and hear that we're not performing the way that they would prefer. We've all been in that seat, so we can relate to it in terms of not only can we understand it, but we remember the angst and all of that. And sometimes if we've gone through a scenario, we don't want the other person to, so we start to overcompensate for it, and to the point of giving them too much latitude, too much latitude based on your wanting to be as empathetic as possible. But there's a counter impact around that, which can have a negative impact on the morale of the rest of the team, especially if it appears that that you have lost perspective or objectivity. So around emotional empathy, you can understand and feel another person's pain, but ultimately it should not mitigate accountability around performance. At the end of the day, that's the most important thing.
All right, anyone else from the audience have a question? So we've got Christian who has his hand raised. Wes, do you want to unmute Christian?
Yeah, hi. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity for a lot of business leaders to embrace more empathy, just from my experience. I think that's been diplomatic.
Yeah.
But so then how do you make the business case to leaders that perhaps are not aware of their need to develop greater empathy and the need for it? Because I just see way too often that it's lacking.
Yeah, it is. It's easier to make the business case in 2021 than it was 20 years ago, Christian. That's my experience. If you talked about anything under the realm of EQ back prior to 2000 or so, the three letters that you often got were ROI. Don't come in here to talk to me about this unless you can demonstrate return on investment. And there wasn't the problem with that was that there wasn't a lot of empirical data that sat under the significance of engagement, for example. Now in 2021, it's the rare company, moderate to big size organization that doesn't measure engagement on an annual basis, because there's empirical evidence that correlates it not only with being able to attract and retain the best talented people, but also direct impact on performance. And so what I've found is now with most new CEOs still land in their first role right around the age of 42 or so in terms of moderate to big size organizations. Whereas 20 years ago, you had to go in with ROI. I'm finding that now most CEOs do not require a business case around those things that drive engagement. Empathy being one of them in that realm there. Empathy is a huge part of inclusion. And a lot of organizations are now putting their really investing in this whole notion of what it means to help people feel they belong And I'm getting the sense in New Zealand, I'm getting the sense that over the last 3-4 years, it's no longer just a tick the box scenario around it. So Christian, my experience is that you don't, most senior leaders now, or people tracking to the table, have lived in this realm of emotional intelligence long enough to realize that it's no longer optional. It's deconstructing what these terms mean, like authenticity. What does it mean? Like on the trust train, what does authenticity mean? What does that then imply in terms of culture? Do we make it okay for people to be themselves at work? Or do people have to put on a mask in order to be accepted? You get less energy, and the negative impact on performance is palpable when people can't be themselves at work in terms of bringing perspective and those types of things. And then with empathy, it's a term that when I was back in the Air Force, 2 terms were kicked around like footballs. One was vulnerability and the other was empathy. The perception that they were soft, even feminine constructs associated with it. Male leaders have come a long way on that front. And so I'm optimistic that you don't need a business case to make the case. I think now is helping people understand what it looks like in terms of practical application. And that is one of the things that I was attempting to do with the book here, was to deconstruct empathy, to have people realize that the essence of it was being present, active listening, just real tangible ways that you as a leader can enhance connection with others.
Right, okay. Gotcha, thank you.
We've had another question in the chat from Marin Matthew. Could you elaborate more on emotional empathy in a business environment, please?
Yeah, so emotional empathy would be, it helps sometimes for a person who is about to be made redundant. To know that the person who's having that conversation with him or her has also been made redundant. It just helps. It's an example of emotional empathy where there's nothing, the person knows you can't do anything about it, but they need to talk, they need to ventilate, they need to piece their life together. And emotional empathy is, it's important sometimes for a boss to be imperfect. It's important every now when you're sitting down with another person and you are coaching them. It's wonderful for a coach to be imperfect and to, when somebody's beating up on themselves for a presentation that went horrible and you're the boss and they're in your office and they just feel like crap. They just feel like crap. They are beating themselves up and you just go, hey, let me tell you a story about 12 years ago. Let me tell you a story about what happened to me 12 years ago, which is connecting. It means that not only can you understand that that was a humiliating experience that I just went through, but you know exactly how I feel is the connection point there. Empathy is, emotional empathy is powerful. For another person to realize in many respects, it's a reality check for them. I'm not going crazy. It's right for me to feel, it's okay for me to feel angry, you know, those kinds of things there. So being human as leaders is not a deficit, it's a positive. And leaders need to tell more stories. That's what general officers do often to put the room at ease. A general officer in a military context will come into a room, take off his or her, and when I was at the US Air Force Academy, 3 generals, they were all men. They would come into the room, General Hosmer in particular, take off his jacket, take off his tie, roll up his sleeves, and tell a story about a mistake he made. and what he's doing there is he's making it easier. He's minimizing the impact of his shadow in a daunting way and making it easy for people to be fallible with him. That's really the essence of connection. And this is what leaders have to do more of. Leaders have to convey to their team that they know what it's like to make a mistake.
They say thank you, Harold. Valuable session. We probably have time for one more question, as we did kick start a little after 6. One more question out there. Anyone interested? Otherwise, we can wrap up the evening. I've got more comments about how great the session was in the chat, Harold. So we've got one last question. Do you have any advice on how to practice leadership in the workplace when you're not in a position of authority? Is there a place for it in the context of a team of equals?
It is. It is, and that's where the trust triangle comes into play. Even if you don't have the rank over people, and therefore it's really peer influence. It is really important to have all 3 of those points on the trust triangle nailed: authenticity, empathy, and logic there. I would also just say that my definition of leader is not a leader of a team. So for me, leadership, any person who walks through the door each day is required to be a leader. For me, a leader is a person who brings perspective, wanting to make a difference. And I don't care if you're 19 years old working at the cashier at McDonald's, or 40 years old working your way up a chain of command. Leadership is about perspective. And so as an individual contributor or as a peer, bringing perspective, influencing perspective, those types of things are very important. So I would just say bringing your voice is healthy. It keeps you engaged, keeps others engaged as well. And remember, trust, empathy, and logic. You've got those 3 things nailed. You typically are in a really good space for influence.
Fantastic. All right. Very good. Very good. Thank you, Harold, for your presentation today, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for sharing your personal circumstances during last year. I think that all helped us connect with empathy in ourselves. Sounds like a tough year personally and for your business. So I think sharing personal stories like that really connects you to the content. Fantastic pieces of information for people to take away. I personally will be buying your book. I feel I have too much emotional empathy. I cried during the news so much of last year I had to stop watching it. To our global audience, thank you for joining. While this is an Asia Pacific initiative, we have BGS members from all around the world watching today. We're really looking forward to next week with our second speaker. We have Teddy Liu, who's based in Hong Kong. Teddy has extensive experience in risk management, corporate governance, and internal audit affairs at one of the biggest listed property development group companies in Hong Kong. A diverse topic from this evening, that's for sure. In addition, Teddy has over 10 years of experience in providing internal training, especially in the areas of financial control, risk management, legal knowledge, and focusing on steering learning programs that align with corporate development. So I think the invite for that one went out today. Make sure you register. Thank you, Harold. I had a delightful time. I learned a lot and took away so many tools that I'm going to reflect on. And thank you all for our attendees for coming today.
Mel?
Yes.
Before everyone goes, I need to take a screenshot because, hey, we like promo material. Please. Right. So if you would like to, Harold, can I ask you just to unshare your screen?
To do what now?
Unshare the screen. So down the bottom, there should be where it's got share screen.
Okay. So, it says you are screen sharing. Shall I do stop share?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. Perfect. I just want to do a screenshot just so you all look handsome and attractive and beautiful. And just from what Mel was saying, while Harold was talking, I was looking at the stats, and we literally did have people from around the world, you know, from almost every country in Asia Pacific, as well as the Americas, and there was 2 people from Europe. So that was actually really, really good. So I'm about to do a screenshot. So, you know, however you want to do it, if you want to turn your screen on or your camera on.
Good one, Oliver.
Thanks. Thanks, Ollie. One more, just to make sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic, everyone. Have a lovely evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are.
Take care.